The Miller mansion stood as a symbol of wealth and legacy. Its marble facade, sprawling gardens, and intricate iron gates screamed exclusivity. Clara Johnson, standing at the entrance, adjusted her coat and smoothed her skirt, bracing herself for what lay ahead. Her heart was steady, her hands firm, though she felt the weight of unseen eyes watching her from behind the gilded windows. When the door opened, Mrs. Evelyn Miller greeted her with a glance that lingered just a second too long on Clara's face, her dark skin, and the neat braids pulled into a bun at the nape of her neck. Evelyn's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "You're Clara Johnson?" Evelyn's voice was clipped, her perfectly manicured nails tapping impatiently on the doorframe. "Yes, ma'am. I believe we spoke on the phone," Clara replied calmly, meeting her gaze without flinching.
"Right."
"Come in." Evelyn stepped aside, but barely, forcing Clara to squeeze through the space without brushing against her. The foyer was grand, with a chandelier that sparkled like a frozen constellation. Clara had barely stepped inside when she heard the sound of footsteps approaching rapidly. Two children appeared, Lucas, about 10, and Emma, a delicate girl of 6. Lucas stopped abruptly, his face twisting in displeasure as he examined Clara. "Mom," he said, loud enough for his voice to echo. "Is she the new nanny?" "Yes, Lucas," Evelyn replied, her tone tight. "Don't be rude." "I'm not rude. I just didn't expect." His words trailed off, but the implication hung heavily in the air. Emma, wide-eyed, clutched a plush rabbit to her chest and whispered, "She's not like Miss Sophie." "No, she's not," Evelyn replied smoothly, addressing no one in particular. "Now go upstairs and leave the adults to talk." As the children retreated, Clara stepped forward, offering a faint smile. "I'll do my best to meet your expectations, Mrs. Miller. I know your family has been through several nannies." Evelyn raised an eyebrow, her lips curving in a faint smirk. "Indeed. This is a challenging household, Miss Johnson. We require someone with thick skin and impeccable discipline. I hope your references weren't exaggerating your capabilities." "I assure you, they weren't," Clara said firmly. Mrs. Miller gestured for Clara to follow her down a hallway, past family portraits that lined the walls. In each one, the Millers posed with cold elegance, their smiles practiced. Evelyn's voice broke the silence. "Your quarters are in the back, near the laundry. There's no need for you to use the main areas unless absolutely necessary. Meals are served after the family has eaten. Do you understand?" Clara nodded. "I understand." Evelyn stopped in front of a door and turned sharply, her eyes narrowing. "And one more thing, Miss Johnson. I have high standards. You're here to make my life easier, not add to my burdens. Stay in your lane, and we won't have any problems." Clara met her gaze steadily. "Understood." The next morning, Clara woke early and prepared Emma's breakfast. She made pancakes shaped like animals, something she knew children usually loved. When she placed the plate in front of Emma, the little girl hesitated. "What's this?" Emma asked, her tone laced with suspicion. "Pancakes, sweetheart," Clara said gently. "I thought you might like them shaped like bunnies and bears." Emma stared at the plate, then pushed it aside. "I don't want this. Miss Sophie used to make me French toast." Lucas, sitting across the table, snorted. "Looks like she doesn't know what you like, Emma. Maybe she's not as good as Miss Sophie after all." "Lucas," Clara said evenly, "it's not polite to talk like that." Lucas smirked. "You're not my mom. You can't tell me what to do." Before Clara could respond, Evelyn entered the room, perfectly dressed for the day. Her sharp gaze fell on the untouched pancakes. "Miss Johnson," she said, her tone icy, "I expect you to learn my children's preferences quickly. This isn't a daycare where you experiment." "I apologize, Mrs. Miller. I'll adjust the menu tomorrow," Clara replied, swallowing the sting of the comment. Evelyn didn't respond, instead turning to Emma. "Darling, don't worry. I'll have Chef Marco prepare something proper for you. You shouldn't have to suffer through this." Emma nodded, and Clara stepped back, quietly collecting the plate. As she walked to the kitchen, the sound of Evelyn's voice carried behind her. "Honestly, what was I thinking? Finding help is impossible these days." Later that evening, a formal dinner party was hosted at the mansion. Clara was instructed to keep Emma entertained upstairs, but halfway through the evening, the little girl insisted on joining the party. Clara had no choice but to follow her. As they descended the grand staircase, the hum of conversation in the dining room faltered. Heads turned, eyes narrowing as Clara entered the room behind Emma. One guest, a silver-haired woman in an emerald dress, leaned toward Evelyn and whispered loudly, "You've brought help into the dining room now? How progressive of you." Evelyn's laughter rang out, light and hollow. "Oh, she's just here for Emma. Don't mind her." The implication hit Clara like a slap, but she kept her composure, guiding Emma back toward the staircase. Before they could leave, another guest chimed in, her voice dripping with feigned curiosity. "Tell me, Miss Johnson, where are you from originally?" Clara turned slowly, meeting the woman's gaze. "New York, ma'am." The woman smiled thinly. "Oh, I see. Not the city. Shirley's?" "No, Harlem," Clara replied, her tone steady. Evelyn interrupted before the conversation could go further. "Miss Johnson, perhaps it's time you took Emma upstairs. We wouldn't want her to get bored down here." Clara nodded, guiding Emma out of the room. As they ascended the stairs, she heard the faint sound of laughter behind her. That night, after Emma was asleep, Clara sat in the dimly lit kitchen, a cup of tea in her hands. She thought about the letter she had discovered earlier in the day, tucked inside a leather-bound book in the office. The words echoed in her mind. To Clara Johnson, the daughter I never got to know. She hadn't understood at first, assuming it was a mistake, but the more she thought about it, the more it gnawed at her. Who was Eleanor Miller, really? And why did her words feel like they carried a truth that no one else dared to acknowledge? As Clara stared out the kitchen window, the faint sound of footsteps pulled her from her thoughts. She turned to see Evelyn standing in the doorway, her expression unreadable. "You've been quiet today," Evelyn said, folding her arms. Clara raised an eyebrow. "I wasn't aware you expected me to entertain you." Evelyn's eyes narrowed. "Don't get smart with me, Miss Johnson. Just remember, you're here because I allowed it. Don't overstep." Clara set her cup down and rose, her back straight and her voice calm. "Good night, Mrs. Miller." Evelyn said nothing as Clara walked past her, but the tension in the air was undeniable. The battle lines were being drawn, and Clara knew she had to tread carefully. Yet, deep inside, she felt a flicker of resolve, one that would not be easily extinguished. The days at the Miller mansion followed a grueling rhythm for Clara. From the moment she woke up until late into the night, she navigated a minefield of cold glances, curt orders, and veiled insults. Each morning began with Lucas and Emma testing her patience, and each evening ended with Evelyn Miller finding new ways to remind Clara of her supposed inferiority. One particularly exhausting morning, Clara stood in the sunlit kitchen preparing breakfast. Emma sat at the island, swinging her legs while Lucas scrolled on his tablet nearby. Clara was slicing strawberries when Evelyn entered, her heels clicking against the marble floor. "Miss Johnson," Evelyn began, her tone already dismissive, "you forgot to add almond milk to Emma's cereal yesterday." Clara didn't look up from the cutting board. "I'm sorry about that. I'll make sure it doesn't happen again." Evelyn crossed her arms. "Sorry isn't enough, Miss Johnson. My children are accustomed to a certain standard of care. If you can't meet it, perhaps you're not as qualified as your references suggested." Lucas, grinning, looked up from his tablet. "Yeah, Mom. Maybe we should get someone else. Like Miss Sophie." Emma giggled. "Miss Sophie never forgot my almond milk." Clara paused, her hand tightening on the knife handle. She took a slow breath before replying, "I'll make sure the almond milk is always stocked, Mrs. Miller." Evelyn tilted her head, her gaze cutting. "See that you do." Later that afternoon, Clara was instructed to take Emma to the park. As they stepped out of the house, Clara noticed a group of Evelyn's friends arriving for tea. The women were impeccably dressed, their laughter ringing out as they greeted one another. Clara felt their eyes on her as she helped Emma climb into the car. "That's the new nanny, isn't it?" one of them whispered, not bothering to lower her voice. "She doesn't look like the others Evelyn's had," another replied with a chuckle. Clara didn't react, focusing on fastening Emma's seatbelt. But as she climbed into the driver's seat, her stomach twisted. She had faced prejudice before, but the casual cruelty of the Miller household was a daily barrage. At the park, Emma played on the swings while Clara sat on a bench nearby, keeping a watchful eye. She noticed a woman approaching, pushing a stroller. The woman smiled warmly as she stopped next to Clara. "Hi, I'm Maria," she said, extending a hand. "I've seen you here a few times. Are you Emma's nanny?" Clara shook her hand, grateful for the genuine friendliness. "Yes, I am. I'm Clara." "She's adorable," Maria said, glancing at Emma. "How do you like working for the Millers?" Clara hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "It has its challenges," she said carefully. Maria nodded knowingly. "I've heard things. That family has a reputation." Before Clara could respond, Emma ran over, clutching a flower she had picked from the grass. She held it out to Clara, her face alight with excitement. "For you," Emma said. Clara smiled, taking the flower. "Thank you, Emma. It's beautiful." Maria watched the interaction, her expression thoughtful. "It seems like Emma adores you," she said softly. "She's a sweet child," Clara replied, brushing Emma's hair back. Back at the mansion, Clara was summoned to Evelyn's sitting room. She entered to find Evelyn and two of her friends sipping tea. "Miss Johnson," Evelyn said, gesturing for Clara to come closer. "This is Mrs. Whitmore and Mrs. Grant. They were just asking about you." Clara stiffened but maintained her composure. "Good afternoon," she said politely. Mrs. Whitmore, a woman with sharp features and an air of superiority, leaned forward. "Evelyn tells us you're from Harlem." "How fascinating." Clara met her gaze steadily. "Yes, ma'am. It's where I grew up." "And what brought you here?" Mrs. Grant asked, her voice laced with feigned curiosity. "Work," Clara replied simply. Mrs. Whitmore exchanged a look with Evelyn before turning back to Clara. "It must be such a change, working in a place like this." "It is," Clara said, her tone measured. "But I've always believed in adapting to new environments." Evelyn smirked, sipping her tea. "Well, Miss Johnson, I'm sure you'll find that not everyone can adapt to certain standards." Clara nodded. "I agree, Mrs. Miller. Not everyone can." The room fell silent for a moment, and Clara took that as her cue to leave. As she turned to go, she heard Mrs. Whitmore murmur, "She's quite poised, isn't she?" Evelyn's reply was a low whisper, but Clara caught the words. "Poised, yes. But still not one of us." That evening, as Clara tucked Emma into bed, the little girl clung to her hand. "Why don't you like Mommy?" Emma asked suddenly, her voice small. Clara blinked, caught off guard. "What makes you say that, sweetheart?" Emma shrugged. "You never smile when she's around. And she doesn't smile at you either." Clara sighed, sitting on the edge of the bed. "It's not that I don't like her, Emma. Sometimes grown-ups just don't understand each other." Emma frowned, clutching her rabbit. "I like you, though. You're nice. Nicer than Mommy." "Your mommy loves you very much," Clara said gently. "And that's what matters most." Emma didn't look convinced, but she nodded. "Will you stay with me until I fall asleep?" "Of course," Clara said, stroking her hair. After Emma drifted off, Clara made her way downstairs to tidy up the living room. She was stacking books on a shelf when Evelyn walked in, her expression unreadable. "Miss Johnson," she said, her voice cutting through the quiet. "We need to talk." Clara turned to face her. "Yes, Mrs. Millers? I've been thinking about your place here," Evelyn said, stepping closer. "You may have impressed Emma, but I'm not so easily swayed. I need to know if you're truly committed to this role." "I am," Clara replied firmly. Evelyn tilted her head, her eyes narrowing. "Then prove it. Because if I sense even a hint of insubordination or incompetence, you'll be gone. Do you understand?" "I understand," Clara said, her voice calm but resolute. Evelyn studied her for a moment, then turned on her heel and left the room. Clara stood there, the weight of the day pressing heavily on her shoulders. But as she glanced at the bookshelf, her eyes fell on a leather-bound book sticking out slightly. Curiosity piqued, she pulled it free and opened it. Tucked between the pages was an envelope, yellowed with age. Her breath caught as she read the words on the front. To Clara Johnson, the daughter I never got to know. Clara sat at the edge of her narrow bed, staring at the envelope in her hands. The paper felt fragile, as though it might crumble under her touch. The words to Clara Johnson, the daughter I never got to know, looped through her mind, making her chest tighten. She had planned to return the letter to its place in the book, but something deep inside wouldn't allow her to let it go. It wasn't just curiosity, it was something heavier, more urgent, a truth that seemed to whisper to her, begging to be heard. Carefully, she unfolded the letter. The handwriting was neat but faint, as though written by a hand unsteady with age. My dearest Clara, if you're reading this, then the time has come for you to know the truth. Clara's heart raced as she read on, the words pulling her into a story she could never have imagined. Eleanor Miller, the untouchable matriarch whose portrait hung in the mansion's grand foyer, had once been a young woman who made a painful choice. Clara's mother. The next morning, Clara entered the dining room, where Evelyn and Mr. Miller were having breakfast. The tension in the air was palpable, even before Evelyn looked up and raised an eyebrow. "You're late, Miss Johnson," Evelyn said sharply. "I was making Emma's French toast," Clara replied, setting the plate in front of the little girl. Evelyn murmured, her eyes narrowing. "I hope you're not getting too comfortable here." Clara paused, gathering her courage. "Actually, Mrs. Miller, there's something I'd like to discuss with you both." Evelyn's fork hovered midair. "Oh? And what might that be?" Clara glanced at Mr. Miller, who was buried in his newspaper, then back to Evelyn. "I found a letter yesterday. It was written by Eleanor Miller. She addressed it to me." The room fell silent, the only sound the faint clink of Lucas's fork against his plate. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, her expression one of amused disbelief. "A letter? To you?" "I think you must be mistaken, Miss Johnson." Clara held her ground. "I'm certain, Mrs. Miller. The letter explains it says that I'm her daughter." Mr. Miller's newspaper rustled as he set it down, his face suddenly alert. Evelyn, on the other hand, let out a sharp laugh. "That's absurd," Evelyn said, her voice rising. "Eleanor Miller had one child, my husband. Whatever you found, it must be a misunderstanding." Clara took a deep breath, pulling the letter from her pocket. "I'd like you to read it. It's in her handwriting." Evelyn's eyes flashed with irritation, but Mr. Miller spoke first. "Let me see it." Clara handed him the letter, her hands steady despite the storm of emotions within her. He unfolded it carefully, his brow furrowing as he read. The room was silent except for the faint sound of Emma humming to herself. When he finished, he looked up, his face pale. "It's her handwriting," he said quietly. Evelyn snatched the letter from his hands, her eyes scanning the page quickly. "This is ridiculous," she said, though her voice wavered. "Eleanor would never." "She wouldn't." Clara kept her gaze steady. "She did. And I think you knew." Evelyn's head snapped up. "How dare you?" Mr. Miller cleared his throat. "Evelyn, let's not jump to conclusions." "Jump to conclusions?" "She's making outrageous claims." "She has the letter," he interrupted, his tone firm. "And I have to admit, some things make sense. Mother was secretive about certain parts of her life." Evelyn stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "This is an insult to our family." "To my family?" Clara stayed calm, though her hands clenched at her sides. "I'm not here to insult anyone, Mrs. Miller. I just want the truth. If Eleanor was my mother, I deserve to know." Evelyn glared at her. "You deserve nothing. You're an employee, Miss Johnson, and you're overstepping your bounds." "Enough," Mr. Miller said, his voice cutting through the tension. "We need to get to the bottom of this. Clara, do you have any other proof?" Clara hesitated. "Not yet. But I intend to find it." Evelyn's laugh was bitter. "Find it? What are you going to do? Dig through the family archives?" "You don't belong here, Miss Johnson, and you never will." The conversation ended abruptly as Evelyn stormed out of the room. Mr. Miller, visibly uncomfortable, muttered something about needing to make a phone call and left as well. Clara was left alone, the letter still on the table in front of her. "Are you really my grandma's daughter?" a small voice piped up. Clara turned to see Emma staring at her, her big eyes filled with curiosity. "I don't know for sure," Clara said softly, "but I'm going to find out." Emma nodded, as if this made perfect sense. "I think you should be. Grandma Eleanor sounds nice. Mommy says I'm like her." Clara smiled faintly. She must have been very special. Emma reached out and took Clara's hand. "If she's your mom, does that make you my aunt?" Clara chuckled despite herself. "Maybe. Would that be so bad?" Emma grinned.
No.
"I think I'd like it." Later that day, Clara began her search in earnest. She returned to the office where she had found the letter, combing through books, drawers, and boxes. Hours passed with little success, but just as she was about to give up, she found a photograph tucked inside an old journal. It was a picture of Eleanor, younger and smiling, holding a baby in her arms. Written on the back were the words, "Clara, my little light." Clara's breath caught as she stared at the image. It was her. She tucked the photograph into her pocket and continued searching. By the time she was finished, she had gathered enough evidence, letters, photographs, and even a bracelet engraved with the initial CJ to make her case. That evening, she presented everything to Mr. Miller in private. He examined each piece carefully, his expression unreadable. Finally, he looked up. "It seems undeniable," he said, his voice heavy. "You're Eleanor's daughter." Clara nodded, her emotions a mix of relief and sadness.
Why didn't she tell me?
"Why didn't anyone?" Mr. Miller sighed. Mother was a complicated woman. She cared deeply, but she also cared about appearances. She must have thought it was easier this way. Easier for who? Clara asked, her voice tinged with bitterness. He didn't answer. The revelation sent shockwaves through the household. Evelyn was livid, accusing Clara of trying to manipulate her way into the family fortune. Lucas avoided her altogether, while Emma seemed delighted by the idea of having a new aunt. But Clara wasn't interested in money or status. She wanted closure, and she wanted to honor the woman who had given her life, even if Eleanor hadn't been brave enough to claim her. The days ahead would be challenging, but Clara knew one thing for certain: she wouldn't back down. The Miller mansion had never felt so heavy with tension. The revelation of Clara's identity had disrupted the carefully crafted illusion of perfection that Evelyn Miller so fiercely protected. Clara carried herself with quiet resolve, but the hostility in the air was palpable, especially from Evelyn, who seemed determined to discredit her at every turn. One morning, Clara was setting the table for breakfast when Evelyn entered, her steps purposeful and sharp. She stopped in front of Clara, her arms crossed. "I want a word with you, Miss Johnson," Evelyn said, her tone colder than usual. Clara set down a plate and straightened. "Of course, Mrs. Miller." Evelyn took a step closer, lowering her voice. "I don't know what game you think you're playing, but let me make one thing clear. You are not, and never will be, part of this family. Whatever fantasy you've concocted about Eleanor is just that, a fantasy." Clara held her gaze, unflinching. "It's not a fantasy, Mrs. Miller. The evidence is there. Denying it won't change the truth." Evelyn's jaw tightened. "Truth? The truth is you're an opportunist. You've taken advantage of our hospitality and twisted my mother-in-law's memory for your own benefit." "I'm not after your money or your approval," Clara replied firmly. "I just want to honor Eleanor's wishes." Evelyn scoffed. "Honor? You're nothing but a parasite." Before Clara could respond, Emma's voice interrupted them. "Mommy?" Both women turned to see Emma standing in the doorway, her wide eyes darting between them. "Why are you being mean to Miss Clara?" the little girl asked, her voice trembling. Evelyn's face softened, but only slightly. "Sweetheart, I'm not being mean. I'm just explaining something to Miss Johnson." Emma frowned. "It doesn't sound nice." "Miss Clara is nice to me." Clara crouched down to Emma's level, offering a small smile. "It's okay, Emma. Grown-ups just have disagreements sometimes." Emma reached out and hugged Clara tightly. "I don't want you to go." Clara's heart ached as she held the little girl. "I'm not going anywhere," she whispered. Evelyn's expression darkened as she watched the exchange. "Emma, go play in the living room," she said, her voice clipped.
"But..."
Now, Evelyn said, more forcefully, Emma reluctantly let go of Clara and walked away, glancing back over her shoulder. Later that day, Clara retreated to her quarters to escape the tension. She sat on her bed, looking over the items she had found: Eleanor's letters, photographs, and the engraved bracelet. Each piece felt like a puzzle leading her closer to a woman she barely knew but who had clearly cared deeply for her. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. When she opened it, she was surprised to see Mr. Miller standing there, his hands tucked into his pockets. "May I come in?" he asked. Clara hesitated before stepping aside. Of course. Mr. Miller entered, glancing around the modest room before sitting on the edge of a chair. He looked tired, as though the weight of the situation had finally caught up with him. "I wanted to apologize," he said after a moment. Clara blinked, caught off guard. "For what?" "For Evelyn," he admitted. "And for not handling this better. It's been difficult to process." "I understand," Clara said, though her voice was laced with frustration. "But I didn't come here to cause problems. I didn't even know until I found that letter." Mr. Miller nodded. "I believe you. And I believe the evidence you've shown me. My mother, she was always full of surprises." Clara studied him carefully. "Why do you think she didn't tell anyone?"
He sighed.
"My mother cared about appearances more than anything. She loved deeply, but she was also afraid of what people would think. Admitting she had a child out of wedlock would have been unthinkable for her." Clara felt a pang of sadness. "And what about you? What do you think?" Mr. Miller met her gaze, his expression softening. "I think you have every right to be here. And I think my mother would be proud of you." His words hung in the air, filling the small room with an unexpected warmth. For the first time since arriving at the mansion, Clara felt a glimmer of hope. The next day, Evelyn hosted another social gathering, this time under the guise of charity. The guests were a mix of the wealthy elite, each eager to display their generosity while subtly competing for social dominance. Clara, as usual, was tasked with keeping Emma entertained and out of sight. But Emma had other ideas. Halfway through the event, the little girl slipped away from Clara and ran into the grand living room where the guests were gathered. Clara followed quickly, arriving just in time to hear Emma announce, "Miss Clara is my aunt now." The room fell silent, every head turning toward Clara, who froze in the doorway. Evelyn's expression was a mixture of horror and fury. "Emma, darling, that's not true," she said, her voice tight. "Yes, it is," Emma insisted. "Grandma Eleanor wrote her a letter." The whispers began immediately, the guests exchanging curious and scandalized looks. Evelyn's composure cracked. "Emma, go to your room."
"Now. But now."
Evelyn snapped, her voice sharp enough to make the little girl flinch. Emma ran to Clara, burying her face in her skirt. Clara placed a protective hand on her shoulder. "Mrs. Miller," Clara began, her voice calm but firm, "perhaps it's time to stop hiding the truth." Evelyn turned on her, her face flushed with anger. "How dare you speak to me like that? This is my home, and you are nothing but an employee." Before Clara could respond, Mr. Miller stepped forward. "Evelyn, that's enough." Evelyn whirled on him. "Don't you dare side with her." "I'm not siding with anyone," he said evenly. "But this situation isn't going away, and we need to address it honestly." The room fell silent again as the tension reached its peak. Clara stood tall, her resolve unshaken. "I'm not here to disrupt your life," she said, her voice steady. "I'm here because Eleanor wanted me to know who I am. That's all I want." Evelyn opened her mouth to retort but stopped, her gaze flickering to the guests who were watching intently. She straightened, forcing a smile. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her tone brittle, "I think we've had enough excitement for one afternoon. Please, enjoy the refreshments." As the guests returned to their conversations, Evelyn turned to Clara, her eyes blazing. "We'll settle this later," she hissed before storming off. That evening, as the mansion quieted, Clara sat by the fire in the small sitting room, Emma curled up next to her. Mr. Miller entered, carrying a glass of scotch. "You handled yourself well today," he said, sitting across from her. "Thank you," Clara replied, her gaze on the flames. "Evelyn, she'll come around," he said, though his tone was uncertain. I'm not holding my breath, Clara said with a wry smile. He chuckled softly. Fair enough. But for what it's worth, I'm glad you're here. Clara looked at him, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. For the first time, she felt like she wasn't entirely alone. The fight wasn't over, but for now, she allowed herself a moment of peace. The tension in the Miller mansion lingered like a storm cloud in the days following Clara's revelation. Evelyn's disdain remained palpable, her icy demeanor cutting through every interaction. Lucas avoided Clara entirely, while Emma clung to her at every opportunity. Mr. Miller, for his part, made small but notable efforts to bridge the widening chasm between his wife and Clara, though his attempts often fell short. One evening, Clara was sitting in her room, reviewing the letters and photographs she had found, when there was a knock at the door. Expecting Emma, she was surprised to see Mr. Miller standing there, looking hesitant. "Do you have a moment?" he asked. Clara nodded, gesturing for him to come in. He sat on the edge of a chair, rubbing his hands together. "I've been thinking about everything you've told us, everything you've shown us. It's undeniable that you're my mother's daughter." Clara said nothing, letting him work through his thoughts. "I can't change what my mother did," he continued, "or how she chose to handle things. But I want you to know that I respect what you've endured, and I'd like to help in whatever way I can." Clara studied him, her expression softening. "Thank you. That means more than you know." He hesitated, then added, "Evelyn will need time. She's stubborn. But she's not a bad person, Clara. She's just proud." Clara finished for him. He smiled faintly. "Yes, proud. But she'll come around. I'm sure of it." Clara wasn't as convinced, but she appreciated his sentiment. The turning point came 2 days later during an unexpected visit from Evelyn's mother, Margaret Whitmore. Margaret was a commanding woman, her presence filling the room the moment she arrived. Unlike Evelyn, she had a warmth that immediately drew people in. When Margaret heard about Clara's connection to Eleanor, she insisted on meeting her. Clara was nervous, but greeted the older woman with her usual grace. "So, you're the young woman my granddaughter speaks so fondly of," Margaret said, her sharp eyes studying Clara. Clara blinked, surprised. "Emma speaks about me?" Margaret smiled. "Oh, endlessly. She tells me you're the only person in this house who truly listens to her." Clara glanced down, touched. "Emma is a wonderful child." Margaret nodded approvingly. "And you, my dear, are far too kind to be treated the way you have been. I knew Eleanor well. If she claimed you as her daughter, then you are part of this family, no matter what anyone says." Evelyn, who had been standing nearby, looked mortified. "Mother, this is—" "Hush, Evelyn," Margaret interrupted, her tone firm. "It's time you learned some humility. Your behavior has been disgraceful." Evelyn flushed, her lips tightening. Margaret turned back to Clara. "I'm sorry for the way you've been treated, my dear. If there's anything you need, you come to me." "Thank you," Clara said softly, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to surface. The days that followed brought subtle but significant changes. Evelyn, under her mother's watchful eye, began to soften. It wasn't an immediate transformation. There were still moments of tension, but she started acknowledging Clara in ways she hadn't before. One evening, after a particularly long day, Evelyn approached Clara in the kitchen. "I owe you an apology," Evelyn said, the words awkward and stilted. Clara looked up from the dishes, surprised. "You don't have to." "Yes, I do," Evelyn interrupted, her gaze firm. "I've been unfair to you. Even. I let my pride get in the way of seeing what was right in front of me." Clara set down the dish she was holding, wiping her hands on a towel. "Thank you for saying that. It means a lot." Evelyn hesitated, then added, "I'm not perfect, but I'd like to try to do better. For Emma, and for Eleanor's memory." Clara smiled faintly. "That's all I could ask for." The following week, Clara made her decision. She would use Eleanor's inheritance to create a foundation in her name, one dedicated to providing educational opportunities for children from underserved communities. When she announced her plans to the family, they were stunned. "You're giving it all away?" Evelyn asked, incredulous. "I'm not giving it away," Clara replied. "I'm investing it in something that mattered to Eleanor, and matters to me." Margaret clapped her hands together, beaming. "A fine decision. Eleanor would be proud." Even Evelyn seemed impressed, though she tried to hide it. As the foundation took shape, the Miller family became increasingly involved. Evelyn organized fundraising galas, using her social connections to secure donations. Mr. Miller offered his expertise in business, helping Clara navigate the complexities of establishing the nonprofit. Even Lucas, initially distant, began to show interest, volunteering at events alongside his sister. Emma, of course, remained Clara's biggest supporter, proudly telling anyone who would listen that her aunt was changing the world. Months later, the mansion was transformed for the foundation's inaugural event. Guests mingled in the grand ballroom, where photographs of Eleanor and Clara's story were displayed. Clara stood at the podium, addressing the crowd with quiet confidence. "This foundation isn't just about giving back," she said. "It's about honoring a legacy." Eleanor Miller believed in the power of compassion, and it's my hope that through this work, we can continue to spread that compassion to those who need it most. The applause was thunderous, and as Clara stepped down from the stage, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. That night, as the guests departed and the house quieted, Evelyn approached Clara in the sitting room. "You were wonderful tonight," Evelyn said, her voice soft. "Thank you," Clara replied, meeting her gaze. Evelyn hesitated, then reached out and placed a hand on Clara's. I hope you'll stay. You're part of this family now, whether I wanted to admit it or not." Clara smiled, her chest tightening with emotion. "I think I'd like that." In the months and years that followed, the Miller family changed in ways none of them could have predicted. The mansion, once a symbol of division, became a place of unity and purpose. And at the center of it all was Clara, a woman who had turned prejudice into understanding and pain into hope. Eleanor's legacy lived on, not just through the foundation, but through the family she had left behind, now stronger and more compassionate than ever before.